to another in our series of interviewing people about their research. Today I'm talking to Michelle. Michelle, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, Ellen. Always a pleasure to join in on these lay summary interviews. Um, Today, I'll be talking about a paper that we've published in EDAC. I think it's the first publication EDAC's gotten out this year, which is mini accomplishment as well. But it's titled The Co-Occurrence of Autism and Avoidant Restrictive Food Intake Disorder. In which we kind of did a prevalence-based meta-analysis, and we can get a bit into kind of dissecting that language as we move on.
Well, congrats on your publication. For people new to this, I'm sorry, I always know it as an acronym. So what is Avoidant Restricted Food Intake Disorder?
Right, and we can call it ARFID. So that's what we shorten it down to, and I do think it's much more digestible. But ARFID
Excuse the pun.
Excuse the pun. ARFID is a feeding or eating disorder that is primarily characterized by avoiding food, and that can be done for a variety of reasons, and it can also involve excluding food groups, for instance. And the three kind of underlying drivers for ARFID include sensory sensitivity in relation to food, fear of aversive consequences in relation to food, such as choking or vomiting, as well as a lack of interest in engaging with food or engaging with meal times. And in ARFID, these experiences can lead to the avoidance or the restriction of food to the extent with which an individual has a negative impact, or there is a negative impact placed on the individual in relation to their physical or their psychosocial well-being, how happy they are, or whether they're malnourished, or whether they have a high or low body weight, etc.
I think we maybe touched on this in one of our other interviews because I'm now getting kind of deja vu. And I think I asked you this in the previous interview, but when you talk about are these kind of three different subsets, or do these kind of types of ARFID overlap, and you need to, like, to meet the criteria for ARFID, you need to experience all three?
That's a brilliant question. Honestly, it's still a question that's being developed. We don't fully have the answer for it yet. But what we can say is that, for instance, you only need to meet one of these, we're calling them profiles. It's kind of been in debate what they've been called, whether it's profiles or subgroups or subtypes. Sometimes we call them underpinning drivers of ARFID as well. You only need to meet one as a person to be diagnosed or fall under classification for ARFID. However, what some research has found is that these underlying drivers or these profiles usually overlap. You're likely going to experience, if you have ARFID, what's known as a combined subtype, where you might have, for instance, sensory sensitivity and fear of aversive consequences, or fear of aversive consequences, which could lead to a lack of interest in food. So there's a lot of combination between these underpinning drivers, and a lot more needs to be learned about them as well. These underpinning drivers only came to the forefront of research in 2022. So
Oh,
they're
wow.
really brand new. ARFID is the diagnostic criteria came about in 2013. So 9 years later is where we got these underpinning drivers, or the acknowledgement of them. So we've only had 3 years to really get to grips with the research about it as well.
So just a couple more questions about, like, the actual diagnostic criteria before we move on, because I know that's not the primary focus of your research, like for this study anyway. So in terms of, like, the fear of aversive consequences, how does it differ from, I guess, other eating disorders? Just I guess with anorexia, that could be described as fear of aversive consequences, such as the fear of gaining weight. And same
Right.
with bulimia, or similar anyway. It's just a kind of different eating pattern, not necessarily, well, I guess it could be described
Absolutely.
as avoiding and restricting. It seems like
Yeah.
they are more weight focused in their diagnostic criteria, or eating pattern focused.
Completely. And I think this is a really important question that you're asking as well. And it's almost the number one question I get when I do talk about ARFID. What's the difference really between what you've said and anorexia nervosa, let's say? And I think the biggest difference between the two is ARFID typically, and this is subject to relative debate, but it's typically not primarily focused on that body weight and that shape concern. So, for instance, a fear of aversive consequences when it comes to ARFID is most likely going to involve what's going to happen to me if I eat this bite of food? Am I going to choke? Am I going to get nauseous? Am I going to experience gastrointestinal distress, a tummy ache, indigestion? Meanwhile, that fear of aversive consequences when it comes to eating and anorexia is very much focused on that body weight shape concern. And that's the biggest difference. And of course, ARFID involves a lot more varied behaviors as well. You get that lack of interest, you get the potential sensory differences as well. So there's a lot more to ARFID, which can also make it a lot less specified. We know exactly, for the most part, what's going on with anorexia. For ARFID, there could be a variety of different reasons behind food avoidance.
It's really interesting, I think, because when I look back at kind of my own lived experience and my own time in treatment, there's so many people that I've met that I think probably would have met the criteria for ARFID had there been more known about it, because they had their experience was a fear of choking or a fear of contamination of food. Um, and they had no issues around weight or shape. I say no issues, but we were teenage girls. And so I think it's, and you can jump in here at any point. I think it's probably quite difficult to kind of tease apart, like, where kind of weight and shape and body image concerns end in a society that kind of normalizes and highly values body weight and shape and diet concerns, when somebody's restricting because of a fear of consequences. And so the line between like ARFID and anorexia like must be quite blurred at times, and there must be a lot of people who are getting missed or wrongly diagnosed.
Absolutely. And I think as the ARFID diagnostic criteria is becoming more well known and it's actually being incorporated into practice, the lines are still blurred after about 10, 11 years. But what we have seen is a significant proportion of people who had or were diagnosed with anorexia or diagnosed with bulimia have actually been reclassified into ARFID, exactly the experience you're describing, where they realize, oh, the primary reason for the food avoidance might not be body weight and shape concern. There might be a bit of that here and there, but it's a lot more sensory oriented, or it's a lot more interest based, where the main purpose is not to restrict for the purposes of fitting into that cultural ideal, let's say.
Yeah. But
Um,
also I think like this doesn't really get spoken about a lot, and I think like the Minnesota starvation study is only like helpful to a certain extent in understanding this, but I think um anyone who's experienced significant weight changes due to extreme kind of dietary restraint or changes, due to an eating disorder or feeding disorder, um is going to experience quite, I wouldn't say body distress, but I guess body awareness that
Mm-hmm.
is quite difficult to kind of describe and capture in terms that kind of don't, I don't want to say don't pathologize, because it's part of a phenomenon that's
Yeah,
kind of, it's quite distressing, I think, and it would be for anyone independently of an eating disorder, or like whether or not like body and weight concerns were part of their original disorder. I think like going through massive body changes is quite distressing and quite difficult to tolerate for anyone. Is kind of what I'm trying
absolutely.
to say.
No, and I think you're absolutely right. And I think it leads kind of nicely into the reason we wanted to conduct this research in the first place. Because when you're thinking about that experience of body awareness, and we actually got some of that in our photo voice studies, where we got a bit of a glimpse into what that might feel like. That experience of kind of your body changing as you go through a recovery process is quite distressing, and it's distressing for a variety of reasons. The feeling of your clothes, maybe needing to get new clothes and being very attached to the way your current ones feel and not wanting to experience that change. That's all distressing. It's distressing for a neurotypical person. Never, and I can't imagine the experience it would be for an autistic person experiencing that recovery. And that's what kind of led us into wanting to conduct this study, because we have a good amount of research done when it comes to the overlap between anorexia nervosa and autism. And those traits of eating disorders, specifically anorexia and autistic characteristics. Some studies note a 50% overlap between some autistic characteristics and some eating disorder features. That's all specific to anorexia nervosa. In fact, there's very, very little known about the overlap between ARFID and autism. And when it comes to some of these underpinning drivers, it really gets you thinking. For instance, the sensory sensitivity driver. How could that apply to autistic people? Is it different in autistic people? Is it more prominent in autistic people? The lack of interest driver. Could that potentially be something we could explore from a monotropic perspective?
That's
You
one I
know?
was really curious about and wanted to ask you about, because um I think from a, like, to me it seems like, based on everything we know about eating disorders, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. Why is there not a physiological drive? Like, everything we know about malnutrition and about hunger, um, there seems to be a lack of explanation as to why there would not be any interest in food. The rest can kind of be explained, like it makes sense that sensory experiences might be different, but no interest is like, I don't think we've understood that properly. And
Absolutely.
so um my sense, and you can tell me what you think about this, is that there's something, that the internal experience is not what's been externally observed, and that the idea that there's a lack of interest in food is what people without ARFID have kind of are describing as like what's happening, whereas the internal experience isn't that there's no interest in food, it's just that there's something bigger going on.
There's
Like,
something that's more interesting.
yeah,
Exactly. Yeah. And I think, as you said, it's been significantly underexplored. We don't know a lot about that experience. The only thing we do know, and the only thing that's come out since 2022, is there's a lack of interest profile. That's what we know.
I think it's really like, it really bothers me.
Mm.
because I think it's kind of quite, I bring this up any opportunity I get, but I think it's really steeped in stigma and the kind of dehumanization of autistic people. And the reason I think it's so important and that I wanted to bring it up is because I think the physiological response is such a human response. The drive to seek food as a matter of survival um, is something that's allowed our species to survive. And I think there's ingrained in the medical field is this need to see autistic people as like something other than human at times. And so if they're seen to be shut off from human experiences, they're not interested in food. They don't even have this innate human drive to survive. Like, that's weird. That's like, and like the lack of kind of curiosity around that, like the lack of self-reflection on the field, like that they've just labeled it as lack of interest rather than what are we misunderstanding
Yeah,
about this?
potentially interest-based system,
Yeah, like
something.
we've
Yeah.
clearly got this wrong. It's more like, see, they are weird. They
Hmm.
don't have these same human drives that we have. And it really bothers me.
Yeah, and I completely understand. In fact, we're both individuals with ARFID, and I'm specifically coming from that lack of interest profile or subgroup, whatever you might call the term. Um, and the way you phrased it is exactly right. There's always something that's a lot more exciting. And then it just gets a little overshadowed because whatever you're focusing on is so exciting that you don't want to step away. You don't want to get out of your zone or your bubble. You're in the middle of something exciting. Why would you spoil that? At least in the moment, that's kind of your experience. At least mine is.
Yeah, like
So
I
I,
don't know.
yeah,
I don't know if I've ever been described as like having that lack of interest um subtype, but I'm very used to having my experiences misinterpreted by others and then kind of framed in a way that just really doesn't match my experiences.
yeah, and that's no doubt frustrating because you don't have that platform to prove that that's not your experience. Excuse me, clinician, this might be the term that's medically used, but it might deviate from my actual experience.
But I think as well, it's like so problematic when it comes to then like the kind of furthering understanding of ARFID and thinking about, well, how do we help people with ARFID? Because if we've like understood it wrong, how like we're not going to be able to help anyone. Like,
Absolutely. Yeah. And
and
that's why I think, part of the reason we've done this review is to kind of get our foot in the door in terms of trying to interpret the existing research in, at the very least, an autism affirming way, in a person affirming way as well. At the very
just
least,
one,
that was,
sorry, just one more question, and then I'm going
yeah,
to ask you specifically about your paper and what you did, what you found. But it seems to me very much as well, like there's like three, well, I'll call them subtypes. But it seems to me that the fear of adverse consequences is kind of an outlier out of the other, like out of the three of them, because that, um, and I, from what I know about this, this can occur quite randomly for people. Like you can just develop a sudden aversion to choking or something, but it can also occur after an incident of choking or becoming ill. Whereas the other two are much more likely to be kind of something you're born with. Is that right?
Foundational.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Similar to like, so I would guess, and I don't know about the research on this or if it's even been done, the other two are more likely to occur in neurodivergent people because your sensory system is what it is. And if we're right about the, say, like the monotropism or your attention, then ability to set shift is also kind of is what it is. Whereas you might have a choking incident at the age of 12 and develop that fear of choking. How helpful is it to have these three kind of subtypes categorized under one label?
I think there are definitely pros and cons. Because with any label, right, you're by default excluding a certain group and including a certain group. And by default, that means some people aren't going to fit this crisp, clear criteria and thus fall through the cracks in services, let's say. And that can be problematic. I think the fear of aversive consequences specifically, at the very least, my thinking, and I'm not sure how supported this is by external literature, but my thinking is that a lot of these, or these three underpinning drivers, were kind of developed because they benefited the most, or individuals falling within these drivers benefited the most from different treatment approaches. Some of them
Different
required
from each other or different from mainstream eating disorder approaches?
both, I'd say. So, first and foremost, ARFID is receiving slightly different treatment pathways than, let's say, those with anorexia. You still get your family-based treatment, your CBT as well, but there are some different approaches that can be used. Sometimes food exposure is used, which can be very, very beneficial or very detrimental depending on the person.
Depending on the person or depending on the subtype?
That has yet, I think that's yet to be found out.
That seems wild.
That's a really good question.
It just seems like the fear of aversive consequences is more in line with like a phobia,
Mhm.
in which case, like the literature around things like exposure therapy and CBT is much like there's much more work done in that area than there is on if it's a sensory based thing. Like it seems like exposure therapy would quite obviously be problematic and quite harmful.
Absolutely. If you just have a sensory preference, and that's not going to change. Food
Exactly.
exposure is not the path you're going to go down.
But there's
Um,
probably quite a lot of exploration and experimenting that could be done to find ways to incorporate like a broader range of safe or acceptable ways to get nutrition to optimize like health.
Absolutely. And I think that's another benefit of these three underlying drivers, because, and this is especially important for autistic people, you know this way more than I ever would. We need to be able to discern, as researchers and clinicians, accommodating and supporting autistic preferences with eating and being able to support autistic people suffering from pathological eating, where where their weight might be impacted, where they might be malnourished. We want to support their well-being. We don't want to change the way they eat if there's no reason to do that. If they're healthy, they're happy, I there should be no reason to have to intervene in any way. But if they're malnourished and they need support in that sense, then we need to be able to facilitate that without intervening on autistic identity.
Yes. That's
Yes,
why I think I'm curious about like the neurodiversity overlap and why it seems like the aversive consequences is like, it seems unhelpful to categorize that the same, because it
Hmm.
seems like the treatment interventions would be different.
I think that's interesting because in that kind of sense, I think of it as a benefit because if we see that they fall into that fear of aversive consequences profile, let's say, then we can take that different treatment approach and that might
Oh,
serve them.
I feel that, sorry, I think my point was that if they're falling into that aversive consequences subtype, my theory was that they're much less likely to be neurodivergent, and
Right.
therefore a different approach for treatment would be beneficial for them.
Absolutely. And I think that's the kind of origin for the underlying profiles. I think a lot of what researchers are trying to do is better understand the similarities and the differences between the drivers of ARFID. But I think I'm going to need to reread the literature for the origin of this. But I think the reason it was introduced in the DSM text revision was because there were benefits to differentiating the treatment approach. Um, that's a good question. Yeah, I'm going to need to revisit that, but I think that was the original reason.
Interesting. I mean, it makes sense, but also worth pointing out that like ARFID is a diagnosis that's primarily been given, or at least when I say historically, I mean the last 9 years, but is something that's been like diagnosed in childhood. Um, and so when we talk about kind of the treatments and things, these are for like 3, 4, 5 year olds. There's not like a strong evidence base for treatments given to adults.
I'd say maybe around 5 years ago, that was absolutely the case. What I'm excited about is that I think researchers are starting to explore those treatment approaches for adults, for adolescents as well. Um, Initially, the research was really strong about ARFID occurring in younger populations, and it still does. It's still identified in younger populations, but I think we're starting to press um, the idea and push forward the idea that ARFID occurs across the age spectrum,
Yeah. Oh,
which
I
is
mean, like
important.
I think I meant like we're like in the last 9 years, like the research is like still quite new, and so we haven't yet kind of got a solid base for like if this is the subtype that like matches like what you experience, this treatment is like known to be really effective.
Right.
Whereas if this is your profile, then this treatment is effective. Like we're not there yet. We're not there with
Yeah.
any eating disorders, really.
Yeah. Yeah. You're absolutely right, especially with ARFID. It's brand new when it comes to the history of feeding and eating disorders. It's a baby relatively.
Yeah, crazy. Um, okay, so onto your paper, only like 40 minutes in.
We had a good introduction. I think that was effective.
We had necessary ground to cover. So what is your paper? What did you do? Why did
Right.
you do it?
Right. So we kind of went into the rationale as to why we wanted to conduct the study. Significant overlaps between autistic people experiencing an eating disorder like anorexia. Lots of research into that area, and yet very little research when it comes to ARFID, which is, a feeding and eating disorder that, as you mentioned, is highly prevalent, at least according to the literature, in neurodivergent people. And yet there's very little that's known about why that might be, aside from the existence of these underlying drivers, let's say. Um, and so what led to the study was that rationale, that want to learn more and understand how prevalent ARFID is in autistic people, and as well as that, what the diagnostic prevalence of autism is in those with ARFID. So kind of taking a look at the prevalence in both groups. So that was what we wanted to take a look at. And there was, in the past 10 years, a decent amount of literature that we could actually pull together. So we had the idea of conducting a review or a meta-analysis, which combines findings from loads of different papers. And our two main questions were what the prevalence of ARFID is in autistic people, and what the autistic diagnostic prevalence is in those with ARFID. So taking a look at the prevalence between both.
Were you just about that criteria, were you using self-diagnosis of autism?
We, because of the review material itself, we had ideas of kind of conducting a subgroup analysis with people who self-diagnosed, but there wasn't a lot of literature that looked at ARFID and self-diagnosis.
Yeah.
So what we had to end up working with, just due to data availability, was either a formal diagnosis or meeting a questionnaire. For instance, for autistic people, that could be the ADOS, less favorably the AQ10, but we did incorporate the AQ10 as well. Any of those kind of questionnaires could kind of replace the presence of a formal diagnosis. And the same thing with ARFID as well.
So what did you find out?
Well, we took a look at the literature, and we had just about enough to get some substantial findings. We found about 21 studies. And what we did was we kind of had different reviewers come together and select the literature. And any disagreements between whether we wanted to include that paper or not was solved by a third reviewer. And to make sure that we were really looking at the whole picture, we kind of assessed the quality of the papers as well. And that's through a risk of bias assessment. So that kind of takes a look at what's the study sample, where are they from, what's their gender distribution, those kinds of questions to see, well, is this paper really specific? Is it only looking at about 10 people who are getting a kind of experimental treatment, or is this like a really big group that could provide a bit more power? So we got some information on that as well. And what we did was we looked at the proportion of people, let's say in an ARFID study. Let's say we had 200 people who were patients, ARFID patients at a clinic, and 17 of those were autistic as well. For each paper, we kind of took that proportion and we used an approach called a random effects model. And that's kind of an approach that lets you combine all these papers together and account for the differences between studies. You know, some studies might be more female predominant or be, you know, focused on eating disorder clinics alone, kind of accounts for those differences. And what we ended up with was about 21 studies. 18 of those were papers with ARFID individuals, and then 3 of those papers only, which was slightly disappointing, were papers with autistic groups who reported ARFID prevalence. What we ended up finding was about a 16% prevalence or autism diagnostic prevalence in those with ARFID, which is about more than 15 times the proportion that you'd see in a general population study, let's say. Some studies note that the autistic diagnostic prevalence is 1% in the general population. And in those with ARFID, with our sample size of about 7.5 thousand, we found that prevalence to be 16%, slightly more than that, which is far, far higher than what you'd see in the general population. And in our 3 papers with autistic groups, we found an ARFID prevalence of about 11%, which is slightly lower, but that's also, we need to take those findings specifically with a bit of caution just because we only have 3 papers to work with.
How does that compare to like the prevalence of anorexia?
Right, the overlap between anorexia and autism, you mean? So those prevalence values vary. I think to my knowledge, there was a rate of about, I think 10 to 20% is kind of that consensus. I'm gonna need to revisit that. Don't take me at my word here, but I think that's the last thing I read about that prevalence.
So is that 10 to 20% of autistic people have anorexia, or of people with anorexia are autistic?
Very good question. And my gut, based off of the paper I read, I think it's people with anorexia who show autistic characteristics. I don't even know if they were screened effectively. But yeah, it falls into that range, at least the value that we have with ARFID. But again, that proportion and that increase in the prevalence is enormous, which really has implications for like how we address treatment approaches for people with ARFID as well as autistic people seeking help for an eating disorder, let's say.
Yeah. I'm curious about so many things.
Me too.
Frankly. I'm curious how, like, what the prevalence is of other. I don't think ARFID's considered a mental health problem. Is it the same way eating disorders generally are? But I'm curious about the prevalence of things like depression, anxiety, because I assume they're also significantly higher in autistic populations compared to non-autistic.
I want to make an assumption, which is not very scientific of me, but I would assume yes. I haven't touched on that literature, but I
Yeah,
wouldn't
neither
be
have I.
surprised.
It's kind of out with my area, but I think it is known that there's a higher rate of both physical and mental health problems for lots of reasons, like diagnostic
Completely.
overshadowing being one, but trauma of being
Feeling
neurodivergent.
alienated,
Yeah.
yeah, completely. Brings about a
This
lot
is
of
a lot
thoughts.
to just like digest and think about. Um, Something like not entirely unrelated, although that would not be weird of me. Um,
We've never gone on tangents, Ellen.
Absolutely not. It makes me think like the figures could be a little bit low for ARFID, just
Mm-hmm.
because I'm not sure about like how accurate the diagnostic tools are. But something I get asked about is the difference between ARFID and what I guess people maybe would describe as autistic eating,
Mm-hmm.
which for people who aren't familiar with this is I guess like not every autistic person has this or does this or experiences this, but it's not uncommon for autistic people to have either a limited range of foods or go through cycles where they only eat particular foods, or with sometimes it's called like a hyperfixation food where they eat like the same food for a very long time. And for me, that can go on for years. There have been like 6 or 7 years of like a particular food only to then stop and never eat it again. Like I did that all through primary school, and then like there was like my apple phase. There was like I've been on so
Ooh.
many kicks. And like I think it's very common. And I think most autistic people can relate in some way, even if they don't experience this. Some autistic people love to cook, love to experience different foods and flavors and try new things all the time. But like, I think most of us can relate to having like some kind of safe foods, same foods. And
Yeah,
so I guess like where does ARFID come into that?
that's an excellent question because even just then you mentioned safe foods, and that's a term that's really commonly used in ARFID communities or ARFID forums. They mention, and I mention safe foods um, because they feel reliable and safe. For instance, there are many people who say, "Oh, I can't handle berries." Because every time you put one in your mouth, you're getting a different sensation. You don't know if one's going to be soggy or one's going to be not ripe. It's going to be sour. It's going to be sweet. You don't know what you're getting. Um, and it really lines up with at least what I'm hearing from your end about autistic eating. And so I can only imagine um, from a clinician's perspective, let's say, that's going to be difficult to untangle. Um, and while it's difficult, um, and unfortunately, one thing to know is that NICE nor CARE guidelines um, have no recommendations on how to assist with interventions for people who are struggling with ARFID. So that makes it difficult
Yeah,
as a
I think
clinician to
just to
untangle.
like jump in a little bit is so safe, I guess like what's describes as safe food in a kind of broader eating disorder context, not including ARFID. A safe food is something quite different.
Hmm.
And so a safe food to a neurodivergent person, I say neurodivergent, I mean autistic, possible, I think ADHD as well, but I can't speak for other communities. Um, the term safe food is used differently, and I can understand why, from a clinician perspective, when they're just confronted with someone who won't eat, they hear the term safe food. That's like a red flag to them. That's something they have to challenge. They have to do something about. That's something they have to remove. Um, I can see, and I can even think back to times in treatment where someone has been like, I guess, treated in a way that was very traumatic for them because there was just no understanding of what they were experiencing.
Absolutely. They were being challenged on something that was just inherent to them, not something that needed an intervention.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's also like broader conversations to be had still. Like, I don't know where or when or who's going to start them about not just the actual interventions around food, but like I think some of the narratives in treatment as well about like needing to eat normally and have like for me, I think I wanted to challenge a lot of my own kind of sensory needs because I felt like there was something broken about me. And I just wanted to be normal, whatever normal meant. And I was told that normal meant eating certain things at certain times of the day and regardless of how I felt or what I was experiencing. And so I think like that's one way that treatment can be really traumatizing. Um, as
Absolutely.
opposed to like the more conventional way we think of eating disorder treatment as like forcing um different things on people. And I
Yeah,
don't think I don't like we talk a lot about like sensory needs and preferences. We don't talk about the communication aspect nearly as much as we should.
absolutely. And clinician understanding as well. For instance, that idea of safe food means something different
Yeah.
depending on the person you're talking to. What is their experience? When are they using the term safe food? Is this something that is just part of their identity? Or is this something that might need challenging, for instance, with anorexia to better their well-being?
Yeah. But
So
like,
there, yeah.
just like, why is it bad to have things that make you feel safe? Like, why is
Yeah,
treatment like so intent on making you feel like you have to feel unsafe to to grow and to move forward? Like, no, let people like blossom where they are.
yeah. I completely understand. And also let them out outside of, those really severe cases that really need to get weight restored, life or death, let's say. Um, sometimes you do really need to kick something into gear, but do we need to other people at the same time as well is a good question. And for the most part, I'd say no, not at all.
Yeah, I think there's ways to care for people in ways that are compassionate and humanizing. Um,
Care for them and make them feel cared for.
yeah, and like don't necessarily involve like throwing them like into like extreme distress in the name of like getting out your comfort zone. Like, dude, I am never comfortable. Like, let me let me just rest.
We're not going to leave this place. This is just how it is.
Yeah, just let me have my chicken nuggets and my blankets, please.
Exactly,
Like,
exactly.
we can negotiate.
Jelly
But
cats are non-negotiable, however.
yeah, jellycats are non-negotiable, and we can
Yeah,
start from there.
yeah. But yeah, I think that's a question that we've tried to raise with this review as well. One of the recommendations that we have made from this elevated rate of co-occurrence is we need to improve our screening measures. We need to improve personalized care. Um, one of the biggest recommendations is individuals with ARFID, let's assess them. Let's see if they're autistic. Maybe we could really improve their experience of treatment through that assessment, and vice versa. If there's an autistic person seeking help for their eating, let's let's throw in an ARFID screening measurement
Yeah.
and
Do
let's
you know,
see. Yeah,
sorry, do you
yeah.
know if, like, how often is it that ARFID co-occurs with anorexia or bulimia or other eating disorders?
It's
Can it co-occur?
So I haven't read too much about the co-occurrence specifically, but I have read a decent amount into kind of diagnostic histories and trajectories. And what I mean by that is, and this actually occurred in my case as well. I really related to this paper that I read where people can experience anorexia, let's say, and they go through treatment, and they develop, a healthier sense of self, healthier vision of weight and body shape. And then down the line, turns out, oh, you actually have ARFID. You're still not engaging with food in that
You're not normal. Why? Damn it.
you're not engaging with food in the same way an individual with no history of an eating disorder would, let's say. So I have read cases of people who've been diagnosed with bulimia who end up getting ARFID, or people who have ARFID and that transitions into anorexia. To a certain extent, there's got to be some co-occurrence there. At some point, the two
Yeah, like
diagnoses meet.
presumably that ARFID would have been there all along. Just
Right.
it was maybe masked the same way no, like autism would have been.
Mm-hmm.
Like I know when I was growing up, like regardless of my own preferences and needs around food, um, like I just wasn't like able to have my own kind of preferences. Like,
Right.
and same
Yeah.
with like any kind of autism related difficulties and needs. Like they kind of came out in other ways, to
Absolutely.
massive cost to myself and my family, it turns out. But like, yeah, it just wouldn't be accurate for like people to look back and say, oh, but she like ate normally as a kid. Like, that's like people looking back and being like, oh, well, she wasn't autistic as a kid because she, I don't know. Looking back, I feel like it was so obvious, but
Yeah.
like, but like I didn't meet the stereotype. Um,
Right.
and I
Yeah.
think I think it can often be the same with maybe ARFIDs.
Absolutely. And I think that kind of leads into what we were thinking when looking back at this review and thinking about what are the next action points, what are the next steps that we can take here. Um, First and foremost, taking a look at masking in people with ARFID. What is the relationship here? Is that experience similar to the experience of autistic masking? Are they, in many individuals, one and the same? We don't have any answers to those questions. And another question that we have raised is, as part of our review, we took a look at some factors that might contribute to very different levels of co-occurrence depending on the paper.
Co-occurrence of what specifically?
ARFID and autism.
Okay.
Um, and for instance, does the age of the sample size in a study lead to a higher or a lower rate of co-occurrence? Is that a factor that kind of influences that number? And what we found was apparently gender and ethnicity were
So what do we know
two.
about ARFID in terms of demographics?
Right. So we know for the most part, the research, when it comes to gender, we've talked about age, which is generally younger populations, but can occur across the age spectrum. Gender, historically, researchers have noted ARFID is more likely to occur in male individuals. Some research further down the line and more recent research has noted actually people who are female or women, let's say, also exhibit symptoms of ARFID to a relatively equal extent. I will note there's very little research on non-binary people or trans people when it comes to ARFID. So very much an area that we should all keep an eye out for, think about pursuing. And then when it comes to ethnicity, a large amount of ARFID research has been done in Caucasian or white populations. But that is kind of a historic issue when it comes to research as well. At least in our review, we tried to be as diverse as possible. But again, we had some papers from Canada, we had some papers from Sweden, but including multi-ethnic populations. We had some from Singapore as well, I believe, and some from Japan. At the end of the day, though, the papers were majority Caucasian.
Yeah.
However, we found that when it came to ethnicity, the co-occurrence rate was very different. And co-occurrence was the prevalence of ARFID and autism together was far higher in, let's say, UK studies, Australian studies, which was quite interesting.
Do you think that's because once you're diagnosed with autism, it's not not easier to get a diagnosis for ARFID, but you're then in the kind of system that recognizes ARFID?
I think so. And I think, Australia, for instance, is a prime hotspot for brilliant research into feeding and eating disorders. By default, the researchers are going to be more aware of it. So it's
Yeah,
going to be picked up more.
yeah,
Um, so that, one of our recommendations is conduct ARFID research all around the world.
yeah.
Of course, that's a non-starter. We all want that. But that's one of our recommendations as well.
It's super interesting, I think, like just thinking about the kind of ethical and political dimensions of research and like what shapes the actual results you end up with.
Completely. Yeah. 100%. And interestingly, we thought that the method of ARFID diagnosis or the method of capturing autistic characteristics would shift that co-occurrence rate. We didn't get very significant results there. It was mainly gender and mainly ethnicity, which was quite interesting.
Yeah.
So definitely promoting future research there.
Interesting. So I feel like we've raised more questions than we've really answered.
Mm-hmm.
So what's next? Like, where is this being disseminated and published? And like, what are you doing? Literally, what are you doing now that this is over?
That's a great question. What am I doing? I ask myself every day. Um, so this journal, I mean, this article has just been published in the International Journal of Eating Disorders, which is great
Amazing.
news. Yes, and what's even more exciting is it was published in an IGED special edition on ARFID, which
Ooh,
is exciting because it means, there's an international group of researchers that are trying to sum up the literature. And usually summing up the literature, as you said, generates more questions almost rather than answers. Um, and that propels more research. So that's really exciting. And we hope, fingers crossed, we'll get to disseminate the research at some conferences as well. But in the meantime, it's always available to read on our website. And we're always thinking of more ARFID research we can conduct. And something I'm really, really interested in is masking an ARFID. So fingers crossed, that's my next step with ARFID as well.
yeah, that sounds really interesting.
Yeah.
Do you have conferences in mind that you're going to talk about this?
So we've missed out on the London Eating Disorder Conference. I know our lovely Emmy Nimbley is going over there with Fiona. Um, Maybe the International Conference of Eating Disorders, if we get so lucky. That would be a good spot. But we'll also hopefully circulate it at the Early Career Researcher Network that Emmy and I are co-leading alongside Dr. Tina Opitz. So getting the research out there and hoping to kind of get everyone excited about ARFID, propel more research, and keep up the good work that we're doing here.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Any final thoughts? Oh, I guess something important. If people are dealing with ARFID, where can they get help?
Absolutely. That's a fantastic question. And I've just kind of come into contact with a UK charity called ARFID Awareness. I think, you can always go to BEAT. You can always go to Support Ed. These are charities that deal with generalized feeding and eating disorders, but ARFID Awareness UK specifically focuses on individuals suffering from ARFID as well as their parents and their carers. So I'd say that's an excellent resource to go to.
Amazing. We'll put their link in the show notes.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Ellen. It's always been a pleasure.
Thank you.